I just want to welcome all of you to today's webinar. So today's webinar is titled Grief and Loss and the Dementia Experience. Today's session will be what we call a panel discussion featuring members of the Society's Programs and Services team. So our first panelist is Castine Breckwoldt. So Castine is a support and education coordinator with the Alzheimer Society of B.C. She has past experience as a bereavement services coordinator at a BC hospice society, and she was supporting teens and adults in her role. Next, we have joining us Leanne Shuttleworth. So Leanne is a newer member to the Alzheimer Society team and is also a support and education coordinator. In her previous role, she worked as the Children and Youth Services Manager for a local hospice society, supporting adolescents and their families navigate their individual grief experiences while exploring healthy expressions of grief. So Leanne holds a Master of Education and has educational and professional experience in this topic area, as well as personal lived experience of loss. So I just want to extend a very warm welcome to both you, Castine and Leanne, for joining us for this discussion today on grief and loss and for sharing your experiences with us. So thank you both. So my name is Kim McKercher, and I'll also be part of the panel discussion today. I am a provincial coordinator in program development with the Alzheimer Society of B.C. Prior to working at the Society, I worked for many years with people living with dementia and their families in a long-term care setting. I hold a Master of Gerontology and also have personal lived experience of loss. So before we get into the content for today's webinar, I'd just like to start our discussion by acknowledging that grief is a natural accompaniment to loss. And as many of us know well, those of us that are on the dementia journey, we know that it is filled with a number of losses. So grief is something people living with dementia and caregivers experience often. We tend to think about grief as being something that happens at the end of life, but we can experience grief at any point throughout the disease progression. Something called ambiguous loss is a type of loss that you feel when the person is physically here with us, but they may be changed by their disease. So we will touch upon what is ambiguous loss today, but also talk about the grief that you may experience when somebody closest to you passes away. So during the webinar, our panelists will discuss how the experience of grief can look different for those that have been impacted by dementia. We'll talk about the various ways that people may express their grief and what that might mean for families when we're grieving differently, because everybody will have their own unique process. We'll talk about healthy expressions of grief and then conclude our time together by going over some practical tools that we hope will aid you throughout your own grieving process. So we do hope to hold some space and time at the end of this discussion for any questions that you may have. So again, we do encourage you to please post those questions in the chat. We will be unable to answer the raised hands emoji, so please do put the questions into the chat box if you can. So we acknowledge that this is a difficult topic for many of you, and we just want to encourage you to stay open as we talk about grief and loss today. If you're comfortable doing so, we'd really love to hear from you. So please share in the chat box one word that best describes how you're feeling in this moment when you think about today's topic of grief and loss. I'll just leave a little bit of space for people to put their responses into the chat box. Yeah, so I see sadness, open and curious, unbalanced, overwhelmed, apprehensive, empty. I see a lot of sadness coming up, helplessness, feelings of being alone. Okay. I just want to thank you for sharing how you're feeling. There is some variety, but also a lot of commonalities when we look at how everybody's feeling about this topic today. We will come back and draw on some of those feelings as we go on in the discussion. So at this time, I'd like to invite Castine to speak a little bit about the ways that we may experience grief along the dementia journey.
Thanks, Kim, and hello, everyone. And first of all, I would like to say that it is challenging to come to a webinar that has these kinds of titles, and I can really appreciate that you've put some sincere thoughts into how you're feeling into the chat box. And this topic can often bring up feelings for people, and it can bring up vulnerability. So, like Kim had said earlier, I would encourage you to stay open throughout this webinar and at the same time recognize that if feelings come up, your mind might wander and you might get a little bit distracted, if you will. Just be kind to yourself and recognize you can always come back and you can always, intently listen again and get further into the topic with us. But just by hearing the words that you've shared, I recognize that this can feel a bit vulnerable, even though you've got that distance of the monitor and we're not just in a big room together. So I would like to start our conversation by looking at anticipatory grief. Just like Kim mentioned, we often identify that grief can occur when life changes take place. It's important to recognize that there's a time when we anticipate certain changes, and before the changes are implemented, there's that sort of space in between there. Um, and when you give a voice to the feelings that come up when you're looking ahead, you're actually giving anticipatory grief a voice. Also, you might only notice a slight unease or might not associate it with the change that is coming. This is normal for us. Often we will suppress our feelings by getting busy and thereby not even exploring them. I would encourage you to be kind to yourself and to allow yourself to express even just simply the unease that is coming forward. You do this by simply noticing it, giving yourself time to feel it, and acknowledging it. This sounds easy. However, I know it can be challenging and unfamiliar. Just remember, it's not about understanding why the feelings are coming forward. It's about finding manageable ways to express them. During my work as a bereavement coordinator, I witnessed people expressing their grief and I would validate their experiences. We worked on creating a safe environment for expression, and we often talked about grief coming in waves. People would talk about triggers. However, there were many times when the feelings simply came forward, and looking for reasons or triggers would have kept the grieving person from experiencing their feelings fully. Today, I just want to encourage you to be comfortable with your feelings and to recognize that changes caused by dementia for both the person living with dementia and the caregiver can create anticipatory grief, which is normal. I want to give some examples of anticipatory grief situations that you might encounter while you support someone living with dementia. As I talk about these examples, see if you can notice if you're having an emotional response. If you're feeling a response, such as unease, then you're experiencing again anticipatory grief. As a person living with dementia, you might have strong feelings around knowing that you need to surrender your driver's license in the future. And this can make you feel anxious, sad, and frustrated. Also, as a care partner, you might feel apprehension that your trusted driver won't be driving anymore, and maybe unease that you will be the driver in the future and you're taking on a different role. So for both of you, you're experiencing anticipatory grief. We often hear from caregivers that they have lost the ability to discuss challenges with their life partner, and this realization comes together slowly over time. As you make attempts to have conversation like you always did, you might notice changes and you might experience a sense of loss of what's to come, and this again is considered anticipatory grief. As a care partner, you will often recognize changes for your person living with dementia, and you might look ahead and recognize it's time to seek support from professional sources, such as a local health authority. While you're contemplating this, you might be again experiencing anticipatory grief. The person living with dementia might notice changes in their own self care and activities of daily living, and they might experience feelings as they recognize their independence is changing. As you can see, anticipatory grief or anticipating changes will stir up feelings. And so, anytime you look ahead, you could have some feelings around what's to come. Often, both the caregiver and the person living with dementia experience anticipatory grief when they look ahead to a time when the person living with dementia might need to move to a long term care home. Looking ahead to this transition can feel overwhelming and cause reactions for both. This transition can bring up many feelings, such as loss, anger, and sadness. This is also a transition that often is discussed when we have support groups or when people are reaching out wanting more information. And it seems to be a time when there's conversation about this change that's to come, and then it's postponed, and then there's conversation about when is the right time to do this. And all of that stirs up feeling, and it all causes people to look ahead and to anticipate something that can be difficult for them. So, in most of these examples, both the person living with dementia and the care partner are experiencing grief that is really unique to their own perspective. And I want you to recognize that that is important to recognize in the relationship as well. And it can make it very challenging for each of them to surrender to their own feelings and also to be there and to support the other person as they're having their own feelings as well. So you're not just dealing with what's coming up for you and what you're possibly contemplating, but you're always worried about the other person as well. And so it can be challenging. It's important to recognize that we all work through feelings in our own way as well and at our own pace. I'm now going to let Leanne talk and discuss more with regard to losses.
Thank you, Castine. It can be so important to acknowledge that those losses that are experienced in the day to day, whether it be the shifts in the routines or whether it be the changes in plans that you are making or the need to alter the expectations of ourselves or others, all can elicit feelings of grief. Each one of these losses can be viewed as an incremental loss, and these incremental losses are not inconsequential. Yet we may not view these losses and the feelings associated with them as grief because the person is still living. Sometimes we have preconceptions about what grief should or should not look like, and we may not even know that we have these preconceptions. And it is often these types of notions that further complicate our experiences. They add those unhelpful thoughts and they limit our positive processing. Grief is a part of living. It is a part of our connections and the changes in those connections. It is normal and it is healthy to grieve these losses. But this healthy grieving often depends on acknowledging it as well as allowing it, as Castine had noted, and allowing yourself or giving others that permission to grieve, if you will. Because the grief experience is so interconnected with the connections we have or the expected connections for what we had hoped to have, how and when we grieve is a very, very personal and individualized experience. There's no one way, there's no right way to grieve. Grief is not linear, it does not follow a timeline, nor does it have a time limit. A saying we would often use is, you don't get over grief, you must go through it. And the process of going through grief is frequently both felt emotionally as well as physically. Grief is hard work, and it can be exhausting because it affects our mind and our body. And even though it is a very personal experience, it doesn't need to be experienced alone.
Leanne, as you highlight, we aren't alone in our grief, but as we know, working with many families, people living with dementia and care partners can feel very alone on this journey. They can feel misunderstood and they can feel that nobody can possibly relate to what they're experiencing. Dementia in itself can be incredibly isolating for everybody involved. There's a stigma, unfortunately, attached to dementia that can heighten these feelings of being misunderstood and not accepted. And this can lead to something that we call disenfranchised grief. So, if you are a caregiver, family member, or friend of somebody living with dementia, disenfranchised grief can be a common experience. The person living with dementia is still physically here with us, but you're grieving the changes in them and to your own life because many things change for the care partner as well. Because this isn't considered normal grief, because society-wide we tend to look at grief as after the person passes away, it often isn't socially accepted or even recognized as grief, as you mentioned. So if you are the person living with dementia, you're also going to experience this type of grief as you're recognizing the changes that you're undergoing. So people may remind you of what you still have and everything that remains. And this is done with the best intentions, as it's important to celebrate our current abilities and what we do well. But I think this can also make you feel like you don't have a space to grieve the changes that you're seeing in yourself. And it's really important to do that. So often others who are not on the dementia journey, they just don't understand the impact these incremental losses have, and they don't understand that it is normal to both grieve these losses and a healthy process to do so. So you can feel quite alone in your grief during this time. I would highly recommend seeking out an early stage support group if that's something that you're open to. If you are the person living with dementia, it is a place where you can connect with others and have these types of conversations with people who truly get what you are experiencing. And we try to hold space to grieve those losses that are really important. And then an example of a time when a caregiver may feel alone in their grief. I think there's many times throughout the journey, but the transition to long-term care can be an example where people feel isolated. So this can be a time for the primary care partner where they're grappling with intense feelings of loss and change. And this transition can also be associated with a time when the people in our social circle are no longer there to offer support. That's not always the case, but sometimes we see a shift. So the person living with dementia may not be seen as the same individual by their friend groups because they're no longer able to participate socially as they did before. And unfortunately, we can hear that this leads to friends and acquaintances cutting ties or saying goodbye to the person living with dementia while they may be in the middle or late stages of the disease. And others just may not recognize that for you as the care partner, that you're grieving both the change in your relationship as well a significant change in your role as care provider. And both of those things are significant losses. It's normal to grieve this loss as a person transitions to care. And it's these times that, again, a support group can be a lifeline. So the Alzheimer Society does offer specialized support groups for family members who are caring for a person living with dementia in long-term care. And often that can be a space where you can talk about these losses, those transitions, and that change in your role, and how do we adjust to that transition. Also, you can connect with your family council at the care home where your person resides, and both of those can be an excellent source of support when you're going through that change. So I'm going to now invite Castine to speak a little bit more about the different ways that we might grieve.
Yes, let's look a little bit closer at how expressing grief looks different for different people. I think you've already noticed that our expression of feelings is unique to all of us. When I was introduced to the grief work, I assumed that people would grieve as an outward expression of their feelings, and many people who came to our support group programs did express that way. However, I also worked with some people who we would refer to as instrumental grievers. These were people that would come into our program and they would not necessarily break out in tears, or they would really openly show us that they were grieving. They would just come in because they had a sense that something had changed, and they knew something obviously had changed, and they were reaching out in their own way. Instrumental grievers would find comfort in expressing their loss by creating tangible and maybe recognizable outcomes. For instance, they might set up a scholarship fund in memory of someone, or they might create a cross at the side of the road. Or as a caregiver, they might get busy making arrangements and sorting through challenges. If you have a person who is more of an instrumental griever, then they might make a lot of practical decisions, and it will appear that they're more level headed in assessing the situation that the family might be encountering. I remember I had a widow who would come in periodically to see me, not even to have a conversation with me, but simply to come in to borrow a book. And she would come in and she would borrow one book after another. And this was her way of working through her feelings. And it gave her comfort and support. When she would come to the office, she would just gently put the book that she had finished on the counter, and then she would, have a small exchange of words, nothing about what was happening for her. And she would just say, "Oh, I'd like to look at some more books." And I just gave her that time and space. And that's a really good way to explain that sometimes we would just witness and we would just make ourselves available to let the person that's coming forward to do what they need to do and to kind of follow along with whatever they're presenting to us. I also led a walking group, and some of the walkers decided to also hike together. And they found comfort in doing this strenuous hike once a week or maybe once a month. And what that really showed me was that oftentimes people, like Leanne had said, they will experience grief in their body. They could feel tension in their body and discomfort, if you will. And so going on a strenuous hike and being with others was a very natural way for them to really feel what's happening in their body and to allow some outward expression of that, and maybe shifting that around for them. So it's really important to recognize that sometimes when someone grieves, it will impact their body. Sometimes people would come in and I would just kind of start talking with them and I would say, "This must be so exhausting for you." And they would say to me, "Yes, yes." And no one has acknowledged how exhausting it can be. And so, as you're listening today, just recognize if you're having a sense of fatigue around this topic, that is another way in which we're actually processing grief or allowing ourselves to become exposed to the feelings that are coming forward. I also had situations where I have spoken with families, and maybe one caregiver is overwhelmed in expressing their emotions, while another family member is more concerned with logistics and seeking services for the person living with dementia. So the person looking for the logistics or more information would be more of an instrumental griever, and sometimes the individual caregivers have difficulty in understanding their uniqueness. So those two family members might have a hard time understanding how one is so different from the other. And as I was supporting that family, I would really encourage conversation. And I would very, very gently find ways to point out that there's a difference of expression. And I would just always validate what everybody's experiencing and be really open to the fact that every expression could be extremely unique. I have learned that it is more important to witness someone else's expression of their feelings and to remain really open and curious. The word curious comes in all the time. When I talk with people, I always try and maintain that open curiosity, which allows them the ability to express further or tell me more. And it comes from a place of me not really having an agenda, me just being curious in the moment with them. And I do find by being curious, I allow them to have that unique expression. And you can see sometimes just a change in how open they are and how willing they're, to express to you. So I would encourage you to find a way to maybe incorporate that into sort of your expectation around how you might talk with people when they're grieving. And when you're grieving, just be open to recognizing that someone else might grieve in that different way that you may not have seen before. And it's best to let everyone express in their very own way. Also, I would encourage you to actually look back on your own life experience And you might recognize that you may have expressed differently at different times in your life as well. It's forever evolving and it's always unique depending on the situation. So every situation and every griever is extremely unique. And that's why it's best to be curious, kind, and open to witnessing. Now, Leanne will talk a little more about family dynamics.
So acknowledging and accepting that each griever is unique can be challenging, and especially when you're in the midst of your own experience. Then trying to navigate these differences within the context of family can add even more challenges. Family members may grieve differently based on many factors: the impact of age, a person's role within the family, and the prior family dynamics are just some factors that can greatly affect both how grief is experienced and consequently how it is reacted to. I truly believe that anyone who is old enough to love is old enough to grieve. And I worked with kids aged 3 through 18 who taught me that it wasn't just their age that made it difficult, but it was our societal constructs about grief that often created the biggest barriers for them to understand and be able to express their grief. Two of the most common requests I would hear from kids when I asked them what they thought adults should know about their grief were that they wished they would be asked, and they wished that they would be included. The kids would often acknowledge that they knew there was something going on and they could feel it, but because it wasn't talked about, they would struggle to make sense of it and often fill in the blanks themselves. And this, filling in the blanks themselves, often led to way more feelings of confusion and frustration. And this often also resulted in those outside of them, those others who looked on, deeming them as misbehaving, as showing negative behaviors, as withdrawing or being defiant or being confrontational. I know as a parent myself, I always want to protect my kids. However, my best intentions and my expectations do not always match what their needs are. Learning to ask and to include kids, creating situations where caregivers and kids were able to share their grief, I got to see firsthand how shifting our perspective on how those social constructs of grief are, we could create opportunities for positive growth and a kind of shared comfort in sharing the most uncomfortable things. So just as I would suggest you approach the conversation with kids based on who they are and developmentally where they are at, so would I suggest that you approach the conversation of needs and wants with those adults and other family members around you. Like Castine and Kim have stated already, I encourage you to hold space to be open to the different expressions of grief. And I acknowledge that this is much easier said than done. We're going to bring up a slide here. And it speaks to the idea of the emotional states that are often associated with grief. We talk about grief creating chaos of emotions, and often a key component to calming that chaos is to be able to share it, to be able to talk about it, and to be able to help others understand some of the feelings that you're experiencing and to hear what they're experiencing as well. Just as you might be feeling a swirl of these kinds of emotions of anger, acceptance, shock, and numbness, and you can see the arrows are all over the place, so too may those who are close to you be similarly triggered, but experiencing it very differently or reacting very differently to their experience. If we are able to share how we feel, we are often lessening the likelihood of misinterpreting what's happening and how others are feeling as well. Just as you noted when we asked that simple question, I shouldn't say it's so simple, but how you're feeling about this grief topic itself, we had many, many different responses to the same situation, to the same question. Again, just highlighting the fact that we do experience it very, very individually.
I did notice a question in the chat. For a caregiver, can you please give more examples of what kind of losses you mean? And I think we often look at what the person living with dementia is losing as the disease progresses, but the care partner experiences several changes that I think are normal to grieve as well. So some of those could be the loss of that companion, as Castine had mentioned, that person that you would confide in if the person living with dementia may be your spouse or your parent. You may lose that ability to communicate your daily challenges, what was important to you. Also, the change in the family role, often there's a shift there for the care partners. So the person living with dementia, maybe they were the driver, maybe they were the organizer or the planner, maybe they paid all the bills, and that shift in dynamic is now falling on your plate, and that can be hard and a big change. And I think there's many losses. Castine and Leanne, can you speak to any losses that kind of come to mind when you think about what care partners go through?
I have a comment, and it comes up in conversation quite a bit when I talk to people on the phone, and it's big. Their future has changed. They've had a loss of what they had wanted to do with their future. They're losing the ability to look ahead to something that maybe they had been really planning as a couple, if it's a husband or wife, or any type of future is just impacted. And there's often subtle shifts, and they come over time. And often the caregiver is just extremely busy with adapting to the change, and they don't just get to sit still and say, my goodness, this was the year we were going to go take a trip to Europe, or we had plans to take the camper and visit the kids in another province. And I'm thinking of a caregiver that they went to Arizona every year. And there came a time where they had to actually decide it's not going to be as easy. We won't be able to take that trip anymore. And so I often talk about the fact that they've lost the outlook of what the future was supposed to look like. And that's a loss to their identity as well. And it's a loss to their hopes and their dreams. And I think there's just so much, and it can feel very overwhelming for people. And it's often just pushed aside because you're dealing with the stress of how to right now help your person, how to get the best care, how to advocate for them. And so everything else kind of falls to the edge. But those are big losses.
Absolutely. Thank you, Castine. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that change and that loss that is experienced by the primary care partners. So Leanne spoke about how grief can look different depending on your role in the family. And so if you are the primary care partner or the person who is kind of providing that 24/7 support to the person living with dementia, you may be a spouse, you may be an adult child, you may be another family member or friend, but it's often not acknowledged how big of a part caregiving is to your self identity as time goes on. It really becomes a role that I think is all encompassing in many ways. You're providing such an important act and service to another individual, and it just starts to become a big part of who you are. And so I think it's very normal and to grapple with that loss when your caregiver role changes, when the person living with dementia passes away. You're not only losing somebody very, very close to you, but you're losing a big part of your identity. And that is one of those secondary losses that is very real and very impactful. And so I just wanted to share a story where I witnessed this personally in my own life. So my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and my grandfather was her primary caregiver for a number of years. But sadly, he did end up passing away before my grandmother did. And so my mom took on that role as primary caregiver after he passed, and it just became a huge part of her life. So my grandmother spent the last few years in long-term care, and I remember that there was this sense of just real emptiness that my mom felt after she passed because she no longer had a reason to visit the care home, and it was something that she did multiple times a week for years. And so it was just this really huge dramatic change in her routine. And she had very much embedded herself in that care home environment. So she knew the other residents, she knew their life stories, she knew the staff, she even knew the regular entertainers that would perform on what days and what songs they would perform. And that connection just seemed to really abruptly stop after my grandmother passed. And we know many families have shared with us that it can be very kind of chaotic and rushed when someone passes away in long-term care. You may have 24 to 48 hours to remove your family's belongings. And that big piece of your routine, that big piece of who you were, is just gone. And so, even though my mom didn't specifically verbalize to me what she was going through, I could tell that she was grieving not only the loss of her mom, but the loss of that caregiver role that I think gave her a sense of purpose and a sense of pride. I think it was something that she was really grateful that she had the opportunity to do for her mom. And so, I saw her mourning the loss of that routine and that piece of herself. And so, I also saw a sense of relief though when my grandmother passed because she'd been living with dementia for a very long time. And I just want to acknowledge that people can experience many conflicting emotions, and that's normal. And it can make it can make the grief process a bit more challenging to work through, because when we have a sense of relief when the person passes, that can also bring up feelings of guilt. And I think as a caregiver, that guilt is often something that we kind of carry along with us on this journey. And I just want to acknowledge that it's really important to just give ourselves permission to experience those feelings and try to do so without judgment, which I know can be very hard. Um, and just please be kind to yourself during this time when you're in the grieving process. Allow yourself grace. We talk about self care a lot, and I know that it's not easy to do. It really isn't, but I do encourage you to try to stay connected to those things that kind of bring you joy, that light you up throughout the entirety of the dementia journey. Because even if it's just a few brief moments a day, if we can hold on to those things that kind of fill our reservoirs, I think that they can provide moments of relief when the journey comes to an end. And it can aid in some way to kind of help us refine our sense of self when we are transitioning out of that caregiver role. I believe the ease of which we make that transition will differ by individual and circumstance. And it might be a time when the caregiver role comes to an end that you might want to seek one-to-one or group counseling, which can be a helpful support to talk to others who are also having kind of feeling those senses of loss, that lack of purpose, that dramatic change to their role. I know for myself, I got a lot of support from a time limited bereavement support group and talking to other people who had a similar form of loss. And so I encourage you to reach out if that's something that would be of interest to you. And Leanne's going to talk to us a little bit more now about healthy expressions of loss or grief.
I think it's also important to acknowledge that, like Castine and you said, Kim, that you're often as a care partner, you're not just grieving for yourself, but you're grieving for others as well as around you. So those expectations that you had for others as well, for those kids or those family members too, can be something that you're also grieving alongside them with too. So you're taking on that. I do really believe, and it's been researched and so on, that grief is felt both in the mind and the body. So for healthy expression of grief, it's often important to think about it in that term and equipping ourselves with sharing the experience of grief. David Kessler is a very well-known author and speaker with regards to grief, and he says grief needs to be witnessed and it needs to be shared. And it really already is often, but to experience the expression of it can also be important to be shared. It's quite therapeutic to express those feelings outwardly and through more physical mediums for both children and adults. When I was working with kids, I would often have the caregivers come in and express some of the worry about what they were seeing with their children doing or not doing, and how they were concerned about the changes that they saw with their children's behavior, especially what seemed out of the ordinary or didn't seem like the way grief should be. So I would do something called the Signs of Grief checklist with them. I'd introduce this. And what it is, it would categorize grief into emotional, physical, and behavioral aspects. I'd go through each section and preface it with the fact that these might be aspects that they're seeing, factors that they're seeing right now or may see later. And sometimes go through the list explicitly, actually gave them context to the changes that they noticed or had gone unnoticed until that moment. And it was really important to see and hear from the caregivers that, yeah, I have noticed that. That makes more sense now. I really didn't know that that was part of grief, but I get it. Okay. Because children often lack the vocabulary and life experience and the mental maturity to positively process the swirl of grief emotions on their own, and because grief is often a very stressful experience, and it starts highly activating that fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain. So it shows in acting out or withdrawing or avoiding. And all these actions would put further strain on their relationships with friends and family, and then contribute to a cycle of unhealthy processing. So by breaking down the grief experience into the physical, behavioral, and emotional pieces, or those categories, it showcased how grief is multifaceted and helped them to understand and shift their perspective on how it was affecting their bodies and their minds. And this also seemed to help them understand that there needed to be a variety of outlets for them to express healthily how to manage their grief and to process it. What's just come up on your screen is something actually called the Grief and Loss Checklist, and it was from Mary Knutson from Health Vista Incorporated. This is a similar checklist, and this is a checklist, again, that I would use as the foundation for creating opportunities for the children and the caregivers to come together to actually express their grief. So we would make things together. We would break things safely together too. We would create opportunities and activities and explore nature or explore other things out in society together too. All of these things showed therapeutic benefits for both those children and adults who were involved. It gave them an outlet. And by being willing to try a different way of expressing, they often helped themselves see that they were individually experiencing grief, but also sharing in their grief together helped them feel a little bit more connected too. It was a win-win. I'm going to give Castine an opportunity to share some more of the creative outlets as well.
Thanks, Leanne. As I said earlier, everyone is unique in their expression of grief, and often different approaches, even like Leanne just said, will provide opportunities for expression. In my work, I've spent time developing different types of stimulus material to activate opportunities of expression. I've learned that we are all open. We all have to find a way to open up to our own experience. And we usually do this when we feel safe and we feel engaged. As you look at your life, you will recognize certain practices that give you or have given you comfort. Initially, you might find it challenging to do these activities again. When you recognize that when you open up to doing the activity and you're feeling that sense of safety and engagement, it'll automatically cause feelings to come to the forefront, maybe feelings that you've been suppressing by being busy. And so, in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is that as you lean into those comfortable things that you enjoy doing, that's when the pain or the grief can come much closer to the forefront. And it is a natural stimulation to get get those feelings to come up for you, if you will. It's important to trust the process. And it is very challenging to do this on your own. And like Leanne had said, it's important to witness somebody else's grief, and it's important to share your grief with others. And that comes through in all the work that we've done. And I might find different ways and different ideas of how to stimulate someone to move in that direction. But I really want you to understand that there usually are very unique ways in which you can sort of harvest your own list of things that you might be able to do that will push you in the direction where you're going to open up a little bit more to your feelings. And it usually comes from a place of comfort and engagement. So I'm going to give you some examples. This first example that I'm going to give you, it took time. It took a long time for this person, and it took multiple visits for this person to come and join me. I would have people come to my office initially when there was a loss, and then we would talk about the loss. And I would ask, how they're filling their time and what they're doing. And so in particular, I had a man who would come to visit me, and we would talk about how he had lost his wife. And during the conversation, he also pointed out that he used to love gardening, and he got a lot of joy out of his wife coming out into the garden and spending time with him, or her just simply seeing the garden from the windows. And so the gardening was something that he did for his own fulfillment, but he also did it because his wife really enjoyed it. So then, unfortunately, when his wife passed away, he found it very difficult to go into the garden, to look after the garden, and to even contemplate moving ahead with the gardening that he used to enjoy. He recognized that the minute he went to that place and he wanted to get out there, the feelings would come up for him, and it would be way too uncomfortable. And so when we were talking about this, initially I said to him, well, maybe it's time to just not go there. Maybe it's going to be too hard for you. And so I let him be with that thought, and I let him sort of mull that over, if you will. And then time went on, and he would come back and he would again talk now also about the loss of his gardening. And so there finally came a point where he decided it was time for him to try the gardening again. And he did talk about how that was very uncomfortable for him. The pain would come to the forefront, and he would have to find a way to either persevere or to take lots of breaks. And he continued to do this, and continued to come and visit me. And then we actually came to a point. I remember he came back in the spring, and he said he was actually looking forward to doing his garden again. And something remarkable had happened. He had gotten back to the place where he really enjoyed the gardening. And now, when he was out there gardening, he had a reason to do this. He had really connected to the fact that he was doing this for his wife, and it brought him closer to the memories of his wife. And so, me talking about this, I think, really illustrates how you have to venture through the journey of grief and loss. You have to find ways to gently allow yourself to express. You have to have compassion and be kind to yourself when it's time to move away from the pain, and maybe do fill your time and get busy and sort of put it aside a little bit. But the gift that will come at some point is that you will come back to those loved and cherished things that you may have done before all this happened, and you will again enjoy them. And you might have those be the catalyst that brings you closer to the loss that you did encounter. It's a very poignant story, and I think it illustrates the uniqueness of how we all do things to survive. I think it's important to recognize that the expression of your feelings and how you do that is unique to you. And the key to going there is to recognize that you want to find something that will allow you um, to be gentle with yourself and to open up to the curiosity of maybe what's coming up for you. I want to talk a little bit about a lived experience webinar that we will be hosting shortly. And in particular, I know one of the guest speakers that's coming forward, he actually writes poetry. And I do know that he found comfort in writing poetry while he was caregiving for his wife. And he found that the poetry was a way for him to express his feelings while witnessing and anticipating the changes for his wife. And I would encourage you to take in that webinar, because he's going to talk about how that helped him navigate the difficult journey that they had. And there'll be others that will come forward, other caregivers that are going to talk about how they're expressing. And, we don't all express in large, big ways. But if you start to look into the different activities of your life, you might notice there are some ways in which you can express that might feel safe and comfortable for you. For instance, I often talk to people about just changing things up by listening to music and by recognizing that certain songs will bring up memories for you, or maybe dancing to the music. Thinking again about taking up a hobby like painting or coloring, doing some activities around the house that give you a sense of accomplishment. It's really anytime you can come up with an activity that has the potential to make you feel safe to express your emotions, and an activity that will give you the ability to be fully engaged. And I think, yeah, it's unique to everybody. I know sometimes there are just, different examples of what people do, but it's important to recognize that it can be very simple ways in which you can find that expression, or at least a way to ease into the expression, if you will. So I'm now going to pass it back over to Kim, and she's going to do an expression that's absolutely beautiful.
Thank you, Castine. And if you're like myself, you may not feel the creativity flowing through you throughout your grief process, but you may be able to relate to other people's work and the creative arts. So, listening to music, reading poetry, connecting with movies, whatever plays, whatever moves you. And this poem I came across, which spoke to me, so I thought I would share it with you all. So it's called Walking with Grief. Do not hurry as you walk with grief. It does not help the journey. Walk slowly, pausing often. Do not hurry as you walk with grief. Be gentle with the one who walks with grief. If it is you, be gentle with yourself. Swiftly forgive. Walk slowly, pausing often. Take time. Be gentle as you walk with grief. And this is actually an unknown author, but is attributed to as a Celtic prayer, and something that spoke to me when I was going through my own loss of a family member. And it just reminded me that my grief process was mine, and it was mine to go through at my own pace. And it was also a really important reminder to offer myself the same grace that I would offer to people in my life. I often extend others a grace that I don't extend myself. And I think as human beings, that's something that we commonly do. So this may, if it speaks to you, be a reminder just to be kind to yourself and that you truly deserve that grace and kindness. And on that note, I just want to highlight a few of some of the tools that we can use throughout the grieving process that we hope will be helpful to you. So just wanted to highlight both Leanne and Castine have in previous roles worked with local hospice societies, and it's a place where you can access grief support throughout the dementia journey. So not just when a family member passes away, but anybody who is living with a terminal illness or supporting somebody can access grief support. And there's a number of programs that are unique to each hospice society. But just wanted to point out that they often have low cost or free grief counseling available. And so that's something to look into, as well as often group programs. And just referring to the helpful resources guide that Ashton has popped into the chat for us a few times, it outlines a number of important resources. So we do offer, through the Alzheimer Society, more information around experience ambiguous loss and grief. There is a checklist that's linked there, which provides a number of strategies for living positively with ambiguous loss and grief throughout the dementia journey. As well, we have some videos that we've linked. One in particular is about building resiliency with a guest speaker, Dr. Drance, which I would highlight if that's something that speaks to you. And then we also have linked a website called mygrief.ca. So this is an online resource resource that will help you understand grief and work through some of the things that you may find difficult for yourself. It is meant for you to go through at your own pace, on your own terms, and it's been designed by grief experts, but as well incorporates a lot of real life stories from people just like you and I. And so I encourage you to check out that website. And then we also have the grief and loss checklist that Leanne went over, which I think is a really nice tool to give you that opportunity to kind of take a self-inventory of your own grief. And there may be things that are associated with the grieving process that you wouldn't recognize otherwise, those physical manifestations of grief. And then I also want to point out that you may want to seek professional mental health services through counseling or seeing a psychologist. We have linked an agency called Living Through Loss Counseling Society of B.C, which does provide professional grief counseling, and that might be a good starting point if you're looking for that. They also offer bereavement support groups. And then we have the Alzheimer Society of B.C. Many of you may have accessed our programs before. I just want to clarify that while we do not provide grief counseling specifically, we do support families as they cope with the loss throughout the dementia journey, and we can help you process those feelings of grief. We do that through our Alzheimer Society support groups, both for caregivers and people living with dementia. As well, you can call the dementia helpline, and we also have education workshops specifically around grief and loss. And I'm just going to let Castine end our session today with a closing ritual.
I just want to talk about, when I finish meetings, usually I ask participants to really talk a little bit about self-care. And I guess what I would say there is I often remind them that they can feel very vulnerable, and for you too, you would feel possibly vulnerable shortly after this webinar or later today or even tomorrow. And I would really encourage you to find ways to nurture yourself. And I know we often talk about self-care, and what I really want to hone in is that self-care doesn't have to look like anything in particular. It can be very unique to you, and it can be very simplistic. It can be simply taking a few deep breaths. It can be about standing up. So when the webinar is over, maybe just stand up and do a little stretch. Move to a different part of your home, look out the window, focus on something in nature through the window. Often these small self-care steps, as we do them, we just become still throughout the day. And as we build on our self-care steps, that's how we really build up resilience. And so I don't have a particular exercise for you, but what I would say to you is do find ways to nurture yourself, and just really recognize they don't have to be big. You could even do something as simple as making yourself a cup of tea. Something tactile, you could just simply take your hands and rub them together and spend a moment just feeling your own hands. Or if you're with somebody in the room, you could have an exchange and talk about something unrelated to what we've just talked about. But the significance is when we talk about self-care, we really talk about getting still, being in the moment, and we encourage people to do this over and over, and that's how they build up their resilience to difficult times. And they learn that if something is very challenging, they can take a moment. And there are many different ways of doing this. I would just really encourage you to just recognize that this was a tough topic. It may have stirred up a lot of feelings, and you might just want to do something to be really kind and gentle with yourself. We've given you that inventory that you can take, and that's another self-care way. It's a way to get still and to kind of just go, oh, does anything on this, is that something I would take off right now? And so again, it can look any which way. Just recognize as much as you can in the midst of chaos. If you can find moments of stillness, you'll be building your resilience. And I hope you all do. And I thank you all for having been here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. If you do have any further questions on this topic or anything related to dementia, please do feel welcome to call the First Link Dementia Helpline. It is available Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. And we just encourage you to connect with us and to continue to have these conversations. And so thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Castine and Leanne, for sharing your personal and professional experiences with us.